Okay guys, I hope you're ready for some fun because this is going to be awesome. We're going to create a full 3D environment that we'll be able to walk around and explore ourselves using a first-person controller camera. Now the first thing that I need you to do is go up to the assets and I want you to import a package and I want you to import the character package, because this includes a first-person controller with sound effects for footsteps, and it automatically has the script attached so that we can use the WASD keys to move around. So let's import that, and that will create a bunch of folders down at the bottom here. Let's give it a second. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to import the environmental package. So exactly the same place, we'll go up to assets and then we're going to go to import package and we're going to choose the environmental toolkit. Basically, it's fantastic. You're really going to like this, guys. So 1 second while this just finishes up. Here we go, we've got the standard assets and that includes a first person controller. It also includes a third person controller if you want to play around with that later on. Now let's go back up to the assets, import another one, and we're going to import the environment. So this package includes textures and models for things like trees and grass and a stone surface and all that kind of thing. So here we go, let's import that too. And this is just basically setting up our toolkit so that we can actually have some fun, really. Here we go, nearly done. Yep, import everything. All good. Here we go, look, there are the trees. Conifer tree coming in, let's use that, why not? We've got a palm tree as well. And we've got loads and loads of different things. It also includes something called normal maps and image maps. So basically it will add textures to the actual landscape as we're walking on it, giving it kind of a bumpy feel. So it's really, really fantastically put together. Okay. Yeah, some don't need to be there, that's fine. Okay, so now we've got a bunch of environmental toolkits as well. And we've got trees, look, we've got conifer trees. Here's a conifer tree. I'll just drag you out for a second. There we go. Here's a massive conifer tree. Cool, right, we don't need you yet. Let's just get rid of that for a second. Right, okay, so what are we going to do first? Well, what we're going to walk around on is something called a terrain. So if you right click and go to 3D object, I want you to go down to terrain. Now by default, it's pretty huge, as you can see. There we go, it's a huge world. In fact, it's a little bit too big for this demo purpose. So while the terrain's selected, if you look across at the inspector, we have a bunch of different options. One of them has a cog on it for settings. If you just click that for a second and scroll down, it's got the terrain width and height. And I just want you to make that a little bit smaller and make it 300 by 300, as we don't need it to be absolutely massive. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, if we select the terrain, what I'm going to show you is how you can raise and lower the terrain to create a hillside and a mountainous area. So if we scroll back up to the top of here, we've got these different options. By rolling the mouse over, it will actually tell you what each button does. Now, the first thing that I want to do is select this one, and this is to raise and lower the terrain height. Basically, all I have to do is click and drag, and that will raise the land. If I hold down Shift and drag, then I will lower the land. These are the different brushes which will dictate the terrain roughness. So at the moment I'm using a very smooth brush and the brush size is quite big. I'm just going to bring that down and I'll just give you a quick example. If I click and drag, we can see a mountainous hillside appearing. Now if I make the brush size larger, then as you can expect, the hill's bigger. Now, one thing I'm going to do quickly for a second is switch to the directional light, and I'm just going to drag down the intensity a tiny bit so that we can see a little bit more definition of the hillside. There we go, look. So if I click the terrain again, and to demonstrate the different brushes, if we select this one, which is a little bit rougher, and I zoom down to the terrain, if I click and drag now, I'll bring the brush size down a bit too, then look, you can see we get kind of a spiky mountain range here, look. But you've got to be careful not to click and hold too long, otherwise you're going to get something huge flying up into the top of the scene, basically. Now if I just come over here for a second, let's add some hillside to this side as well. Let's increase the brush size and just drag this around. Here we go. Looking good, looking good. Now, it doesn't look too much like landscape at the moment because it doesn't have any texture applied to it, but just bear with me, guys. That's all about to change very shortly. So let's just make something up here, like a larger. I want to create some kind of background for us to have a look at. There we go. I don't want to go too crazy with it because I actually want to be able to walk around this thing. And let's just dot around a few bumpy areas here at the base of the hillside. Bring the brush size down a bit and just give it a little bit of a... There we go. So this is all just trial and error. Yours will look completely different to mine. If you make a mistake, remember, you can just hold shift and click, and that will lower the hillside. Now, if it's a little bit too spiky like this, for example, the next button along will actually set the terrain height, and then the third one will smooth the terrain height. So I can actually click and smooth this out. Can you see? And it will actually reduce the spikiness of the hillside. Now, this is particularly a good and don't have too many big spiky edges. And that's because all these spiky edges are called polygons. And the higher the polygon count, meaning the amount of triangles, is going to use up more and more processing power of the mobile phone. So I'm just going to just block this off a little bit around this side. If I just select, there we go. Cool. So it doesn't really matter because we're not going to go all the way around this thing. I just want to show you how we can actually create a world, and it will be quite huge, trust me. Now, how do we make it look like land? Well, if we come across to the paintbrush, this is how you can add textures. And if I just click edit textures and then add a texture, then I get this little pop-up box here. Now, if I click select, I can choose a texture to use as the base textures. And by scrolling through the list, one of them, here look, is called Grass Hill Albedo. And that's exactly what this thing wants. Now, if you want to add a normal map, which is a texture field, you can choose one of these kind of purple looking ones, and that will give it a texture. But for now, I'm happy as it is. Now, before I click OK, if I just get rid of this, watch what happens when I add the first base texture to our terrain. All of a sudden, look, it starts to look like real land. And if you came right down, then it definitely starts looking like a real world. Now, let's add a second texture and make these spiky kind of mountainous areas look more like mountains. So if we click edit textures and add a new one, I'm going to add the rock face here and add that one. And then by using the paintbrush, I can select a brush and increase the opacity so that it then overrides the base texture, and I can kind of paint mountainous edges onto this surface. I'll just increase it even more. Oh, if I choose that one, it will work a little bit better. There we go. So, look, see, now we're getting kind of a stony rock feel to the actual hillside. And that can work exactly the same. Maybe you want to add some snow to the top of this. then all you need is kind of a brush. And maybe a little bit too much there, so let's bring that down a bit. There we go, look. And I can add some grass back on the hill. I'm just simply painting it on. And you can have some real fun with this and go into it in as much detail as you want. You can also add your own textures. And like I said, if you wanted to make snow-capped, all you'd have to do is add a texture, which you could create in Photoshop, for example. And then you could right-click and import the new asset. And then you could select your new texture. And it would load here. And that way you would have access to do exactly the same. So you could create a canvas in Photoshop that's 512 by 512 with kind of a ice snow look to it, and then we could use that as a texture to kind of paint on top of this terrain and give it kind of a snow-capped feel to it. Now, one thing that's missing is a little bit of grass and a few trees. So let's click the terrain again and move across to the next button, which is for trees. And like I said, because we imported the environmental assets, we've got things like conifers and palm trees and other things. Now, all it needs is for me to select a tree, because at the moment I don't have any trees defined. So if I click edit trees and add a tree, it's looking for a game object. So let's find a tree. And let's choose the conifer here, double click and add. Now we have a tree loaded in. Let's just add one more. Here we go. And get some palm trees. Why not? I mean, they're probably not going to look very good next to each other, but it's just as an example. Now, look at the brush size and look at the tree intensity. Also, look at the tree height. I'm going to bring that right down because I don't want the trees to be absolutely 100 meters in the sky. It won't look realistic. But if I click, I can place trees, look. If I zoom down, I can actually see, oh, too far. I can actually see the trees that I've created. It might be a little bit small, let's make them bigger. Let's move over here and create some palm trees. There we go, so they're a bit bigger. And now let's add some conifers. Just having a think for a second. There we are, they're a little bit too big. Let's shrink them down a bit. There we go. So I'm just going to paint a bunch of trees. Whoa, wow, we've got a jungle now. Okay. So we've got a cool, different variety of things now. Now, if I bring my brush size down, then it will actually give me more control over the amount of trees that I place. There we go. Now, one last thing before we decide to actually have a play in this area is I want to add a little bit of grass. So let's come across to this last button and then it wants some grass. So let's add a grass texture. And the one that I want is this one here. So let's choose this grass frond 01 albedo alpha. Let's click on that one and add it. And then if I increase the brush size, I can kind of paint some grass areas onto the texture. There we go, look. And it doesn't look fantastic. I'm just giving you guys a bit of a demonstration about the different things that you can do. I just dot this about a little bit, make it a little bit smaller, the brush. Then we kind of have bushes instead. And if I lower the opacity, then that will make the grass a little bit more sparse. Okay, so now we've, within minutes, created a terrain with trees and grass and a rocky surface and a bunch of other things. How about we have a walk around this place? Let's come up to the top level of the assets. Apologies if you can hear the fan of the laptop. I'm just going to move that away slightly. What I want to do is go into the characters folder, into the first person controller, into prefabs, and then we have this thing here, which is a first person controller. So this is kind of like your Call of Duty camera setup where you're actually looking through the camera from the character's eyes. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to drag my first-person controller out onto the scene. There we go. Now, it's appeared here, and it already has a camera attached to it. So that means that I don't need this one. I can get rid of that initial camera. There we go. And I'm now going to tag this as the main camera. If I double click on the FPS controller, it will zoom right down, and you can see, well, already this is going to look pretty cool. You can see the first person controller. However, they use a capsule, and you need to move that up a little bit. Now, it's also a little bit small. So let's increase the size a little bit by adjusting the scale and just pulling this up. And that's how you can adjust the height of the character. Okay, now if we come around, you can see where the actual camera is facing. And if we look at the game view now, this is what the camera will actually see when the game begins. Now remember, when we imported the standard assets and the character pack, it came with a first-person controller script. And here, look, in the inspector, you can decide on the speed that you walk and run around and a bunch of other different things. You can also use a spacebar to jump. Okay, so check this out. Let's go to maximize on play and click play. This is going to use... I'm going to turn the volume down a little bit because I'm hooked up to a bigger sound system. But now I can use my mouse to look around the world that we've just created. How cool is that? I can also use W, A, S and D on the keyboard to actually walk around and space to jump. And I can go and explore and look at all these cool trees that we've just created. We can walk up the hills and we can jump and we can go and explore wherever we want. Now if I just press escape, that will give me my arrow back and I can come out of play mode. Now let's just make a slight adjustment. I'm going to make the start position of my first person controller to be somewhere over here. Just double click and zoom back into him and make sure that we're above land when we start. There we go. And this time I'm also going to rotate the camera. So let's rotate on the axis here and press play again. And now it starts me in a completely different area. I can still walk up the hills unless they're too steep, but as with other games, you press space and you can jump up. And it's that simple, guys. It's that simple. You can just build a terrain in minutes using Unity's pre-built assets. Now, if you went to the asset store, you could also download additional trees. You can also download additional textures. You can even download something called a skybox, which will change the color and the feel of the sky. Now, if I come out of this for a second, one of the other things that I want to show you guys, if I bring my first person controller back over towards the trees, like that. There we go, that's about right. We're going to be looking at the trees. I want to add something called a wind zone. Now, it only works with certain trees, this, but let's add a wind zone onto the actual scene. Right click, 3D object, wind zone.